Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome to our session today. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Marwaz. I'm going to be telling you a little bit about her, and then we'll bring her on, inshallah. So Dr. Azab is currently teaching for the psychology department at Cal State University, Long Beach. She is also taught for the biology department at University of California, Irvine. She has a master's in counseling psychology and a PhD in neuroscience. She writes for the Psychology Today. Her blog is called Neuroscience in Everyday Life. She has spoken all over the United States, Canada, and Singapore. She has delivered 5 TEDx talks, such as Are You Highly Sensitive? Should You Change? She has been interviewed on the radio and various media outlets, such as Vice Magazine, The Daily Beast, and the 49ers. Her work has been translated into Arabic and Portuguese. She was listed by VirgoWoman.com as one of the top 10 inspirational women. She is constantly connecting psychology, biology, and the perfect words of Allah to understand the human soul from a more complete Islamic perspective. She is currently writing a book on mental health and Islam. Most importantly, she is the mother of 3 children living with her husband and children in Southern California. So, mashallah, very impressive. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Marwaz.
Jazakallahu khairan. The honor is mine with Mass today. Assalamu alaikum wa barakatuh. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan. So, inshallah, I would like to share the screen. Okay, inshallah, everyone can see the screen just fine. Yasmin, can you see it? So no, can you see it? Just, I don't know. I can't read because it, the screen occupied by the PowerPoint. You can see the screen when I shared it?
No, we can't see it. Can you close it and share screen again? Just stop sharing and then try sharing again.
Yeah, inshallah. Can you see it now? Yes, I think you can. Do you see it, Yasmin?
So that it's full screen.
You can see it?
Yes.
Alhamdulillah. All right, let's start then. Assalamu alaikum again. So it's my honor to be here today with Mass, their 23rd conference, virtually this year. And I think the topic couldn't be more appropriate for this year, 2020, the topic of worry and anxiety. So I was interviewed for a documentary for the BBC. And, I thought the first question that the journalist is going to ask me had to do with anxiety, worry, neuroscience, something that has to do with my background. But she asked me an extremely unanticipated question that I'll tell you about for a sec. But asked me, I want you to think about 2020. What was the #1 reason for your anxiety, worry, stress? Just think about it, the #1, and if you can put it in the chat, that would be great. He's there. So I'll count to 3 seconds and then move on, inshallah. Okay, so the first question that she actually asked me was not about, works or how an anxiety is represented in the brain, but rather she asked me, why do we have a toilet paper epidemic? That was the #1 question she asked me first. And the reason was, or the answer that I gave her is that, subhanAllah, human brain, the way that we are created, when we have overwhelming anxiety and a fear that we can't quite understand, what we do is we make up a problem that we can solve. So, the problem of the epidemic, the problem of the virus, the problem of COVID is something that was too big for us to understand. That was this is on a global level. So instead, what we did is we created, okay, well, let's create this pandemic for toilet paper. And even though it doesn't make sense why that would go. So the second thing I want to ask you, and then it would have been really nice if you're in front of me so I can see your reaction. But is I want you to think about these things, and in your head, think true or false. And feel free to put it in the chat if you would like to, but you don't have to. But think about it, and inshallah, we'll address each one of these, whether it's true or false, right? There's no perfect answer throughout the talk. One, do you think an anxiety is something bad? If I have a magic wand, would you want to get rid of all of it? So that's the first question, true or false. Second, do you think that an anxiety is the same emotion as fear? Are they equivalent? Are these, just is it the same meaning when you say I'm afraid or I feel fear? The other thing is like how intimately related or not related do you think stress and an anxiety? In other words, do you think stressful situations cause an anxiety for everybody? Think about yourself, think about the people you live with, think about the people you see at the masjid. The other thing, which is something, if you suffer from disorder, maybe you've heard from other people, and that is an anxiety is all in your head. Fairy tale that you have in your head about how terrible this world is. And last but not least, and perhaps related to the question I just asked, is that an anxiety is your fault. Why you suffer from an anxiety is something that. So whether you said to true or false, you know enough if it's true or false. First, let's tackle the first one. An anxiety, is it okay to be anxious? Unlike depression is never an okay emotion to have. It's never okay to be, it's fine to be sad. In fact, if you are not showing sadness in situations where you should be sad, that would be an abnormal reaction if you're showing happiness instead. However, depression is a lot more than sadness. With an anxiety, though, that is a normal emotion that Allah has created for us to increase performance, to sharpen our focus, to let us know that here's an alarm for danger, that we need to do something. We need to interrupt our present moment to do something, right? We need to change our behavior. So if for example, I wasn't anxious about today's talk a little, I'll just wait till 4 p.m. and just wing it and say something about an anxiety. I'm sure I'll come up with something, right? And then probably you on the other side would be very frustrated with me kind of coming up with thoughts last minute. So an anxiety can be very adaptive, as I said, in terms of increasing and making your cognitive abilities more sharp. And it's a perfect alarm system that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created for us. The other question there had to do with an anxiety and fear. Are these synonymous? And actually, anxiety and fear are not synonymous. They're very different emotions. They are psychologically different. They are biologically different. They are hormonally different. And they focus on different things. So they're definitely not the same thing. Fear is something that's specific. You are scared of one particular situation, of one particular object, of one particular person. And if that object, that situation, that person, the animal, a snake, a dog is gone, your fear, shortly after, also goes away. The hormonal stress things that were released in your body as a result of the fear also level off and they go away and they're washed, from your body. Your overreactive fear centers in the brain also go back to balance, right? And that's for fear. You're focused on the present moment, and that's a critical thing. As for an anxiety, and people who suffer from the pains of generalized anxiety disorder know exactly what I'm talking about. Here, it's not specific in the present moment. So if someone is having an anxiety attack and I tell them, you know what, I want to support you. What can I do? What can I take away right now? Is there anything I can stop doing? Is there anything I can say that will make this anxious, ugly feeling go away? And they will say, I don't know. Because it's not specific. Is that you are anxious. You're preparing for an inevitable, something bad that's going to happen at an unknown time. That's how very vague it is. So an anxiety is something that is very future oriented. You're actually with an anxiety, and that's a big difference between an anxiety and fear. And also in terms of what you're thinking, is that an anxiety is very future oriented. It actually robs your present moment. So it takes you away from the present moment, and you basically then are like always like advanced in the future, and you're missing out on, maybe your child's first step, maybe your child's first word, maybe, your partner's call for help. A lot of things in the present moment you can miss out on as a result of this. So that needs, and also, so biologically also, the circuit in the brain that's involved in supporting this anxiety and making you feel this knots in your stomach and all of the things we say linguistically, that circuit in the brain is a lot more complicated and complex than actually the circuit in the brain that represents fear. A lot more involved than in anxiety. Okay, very, very broad, and that's what, again, I want that a dose of it as an inverted U. A dose of an anxiety is not necessary for you to be motivated to get up and do something. It's necessary for you to get up and go to work on time, to prepare for a talk, test, to do all of these things. A healthy dose, again. Too much will impair your performance. Too little, you'll be you don't have enough motivation. And with fear, though, if you're in fear, then it's very difficult to perform. So it's a little bit different. The other thing, and particularly if you are a person who suffers from clinical anxiety, you might have heard something like this, which is very stigmatizing, unfortunately, is an anxiety is my fault. Here's the thing with an anxiety disorder. Sometimes the person who suffers from an anxiety is an A student, is a person who has been promoted like 1,000 times the last year at their job, is a person who's doing exceptionally well. And, people look from the outside, wow, this person has everything they want. What are they complaining about? What an anxiety, what's suffering? But an anxiety, though, is kind of like termite, like inside. And it's very painful, particularly if you have an anxiety attack or a panic attack. You feel like you're going to die. And the person is willing to do anything to get rid of this feeling, an anxious feeling. Why are we like that? People just really anxious to the point where now you're in the other arm of the inverted U. Now you're in the arm now going down in terms of performance, in terms of your cognitive abilities, in terms of your social skills. There are multiple reasons. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created all of us with different tests, with different hardships. And one of these could be the genetics that you inherit, right? Like some genetics that a person inherits more predisposed to an anxiety than other people. So, you might be, something neutral may happen, planning for something neutral, like a get together next Friday or something. And, the person is extremely overwhelmed, days of work. They are, they're fighting with everybody, with their family, that they just get very easily. That threshold for them is really low in terms of what's stressful. Meanwhile, someone else can be, finishing a project and, doing all of these extracurriculars and running a marathon the day they're having the get together, and they're able to handle all of this. One is better than the other. It's like, depending on your genetics and many other things, it can be much more easier for someone because they have this extra push from the genetics, or they have this extra push backwards. That makes it harder for them to progress towards whatever goal they're planning for. We know genetics is a part of this. We know anxiety runs in families. We know if that someone has a panic attack, they, in your family had a panic attack, 8 times more likely to also have a panic attack. So we know genetics is a part of it. The other big one is early life experiences, right? Like what kind of life experiences did you have early on in life? So for example, people who have extremely, extremely strict parenting. Strict parenting has been associated with more anxiety later on in life. People who come from insecure attachment with their parent, usually the mother, that insecure attachment with the mother, that unstable, unpredictable environment which should trust the most, that also can make the person at a much higher chance of experiencing an anxiety later on in life. And it leads kind of predisposition and that vulnerability for the rest of their life. But how about if you're like, genetically, I had an X excellent, secure attachment with my family. And then all of a sudden you're in your 20s or you're a teenager and you happen to be, graduating high school, starting university, and it's 2020 and you miss your graduation. And you are sold to on the story of like all of this is very stressful and it's very uncontrollable and you feel very helpless. Well, that kind of packaging, that kind of perceptual packaging of what's happening around you in 2020 and your understanding of the COVID-19 can actually make you now, even though you don't have the genetic background or mental as in early life experiences, then you now begin to have an anxiety disorder. Maybe, and I worry about this generation, in fact, it just has gone through this enormous that we adults are trying to still digest what's going on. And then also in light of looking at leaders and how presidents and people were supposed to be, debate, and looking at the world ahead and trying to understand that. And like, I'm going to admit as an adult, why did we, with we try to say, here's what this could be perceived at. That can just give rise to, and he supports this, that anxiety is on the rise in 2020. The other thing is the of strict parenting, which is, maybe very sheltered, where I guess it could be under the same umbrella, where the child has never gone through experiences of failure or rejection, right? Like we, from maybe the 70s, 80s onwards, it was all about, definitely no shaming children, definitely no consequence, reward everything. It's, wow, you went to school today. Here is, in and out or whatever, rewarding every single mundane, normal, common behavior they're supposed to do when they turn this age, right? Like we kind of a society that give, right? Like when the teen, turns 16, they can go get the driver license. When they turn, depending if you're in Canada or the States where you are, if they turn 18 or 21, then they can drink alcohol. And it's like, okay, so at what age do they give back to society? When does that conversation happen? And then you have this person who looks like a grown-up adult, but they're not a grown-up adult. And then now they're supposed to be in a job and they're going to be rejection. There's going to be failures. And they have their first encounter with their boss or someone shames them or embarrasses them, and the world just falls apart. Because they haven't experienced this rejection where they can come back then to their secure attachment, their mother, their father, mentor, and say this and this happened. And then there's some. So unfortunately, we are, the Western way of thinking is that you go from complete dependence during infancy and being a toddler, and somehow you then graduate into complete independence. But there has to be a training session of interdependence, and that should be in your teen years. So it's again, in 2020, that all of these things can be very challenging to parents and adults who are already stretched too thin because of what's going on. Like, think about it, some years later, who are raised on Zoom with parents who are very stressed out, working from home, are going to be leaders of tomorrow. So, we got to be really careful what we say in front of them. The other things that was said, true or false, is that stress causes an anxiety. Okay, so there's actually a big truth to that. Okay, we can't say that stress causes an anxiety for everybody, but a big dose of stress can cause an anxiety. In fact, the stress system, the hormones that are released during stress, the brain circuits that are activated by stress, very much overlap a lot by the systems that that process or represent an anxiety. We know that there is definitely an intimate relationship between them. Now, I want to make a very clear distinction between stress that is controllable and stress where the helpless and they can't control it. I can tell you one thing that's kind of sobering. If you stress them out and you to be helpless, like an electric shock, these animals develop cancer. And maybe that's not scary, but you know what the scary part is that when the animal who has been taught to be helpless, because you can be taught to be helpless, and we got to be very careful around people around us not to teach them to be helpless. So, that's something that can be acquired, even if opportunity comes for the animal to escape danger, and they can just press a lever and leave, they got to this habitual thinking of I'm helpless at myself, I can't, just takes over. And this very much happens in human beings as well. So, however, though, stress, if it of controlling, that you can control aspects of it, just that's why we created the toilet paper problem. Remember, I started with that. If we, if packaged in such a way that, one, you're not stigmatizing, this is not stressful, what are you talking about? That, let's empathize, let's sympathize, let's try to help, even if it's just listening. But at the same time, can we help find any control areas where the person control? So in fact, it work with this under, in my opinion, my humble opinion, very of the COVID-19. I mean, this year you had COVID-19, you had the fires of year in California that just could not be extinguished. You had, it was an election year. You had all of these things Black Lives Matter, right? You had all of these things in 1 year. Earthquake, everything just happened, alhamdulillah, this year. So, we need to think, like, we can't just keep going our day. Like, we got to step back and think. SubhanAllah, in the Quran, it says 1,000,000 times for us to use our aql. We have to use our brain, right? Aql, right? Process that and find, again, like, I encourage you to, if you live with people in the house, like, sit down and find out, okay, so out of all of this, of course we can't control everything, but we have control over, right? And particularly, giving a hand or explain this to the next generation. The other thing, okay, is that we have to be very careful how we show our anxiety to the people we live with, right? We, many of us live with children, with a spouse, with extended family, or maybe not. But how, even if you're just alone, how do you, stop for a second and say, what do I think like? What do I look like when I'm anxious? Right? So, and I invite you to think about these points, right? And even more, but in the interest of time, we'll just focus on that. Is that, what language are you using when you're anxious? And there is very specific type of language that's used when a person is anxious. So, for example, they found that when moms play with their children, like just, playing with their 4-year-old or whatever, is that mothers who are anxious tend to be speaking in the future tense than the present tense. So, you're teaching your child one-on-one, like, you're always thinking in the future and missing out completely on the present. I said earlier, an anxiety of the present moment. The other thing, you can just, like, randomly ask somebody, say, can you record the I'm getting tense? And you yourself can listen to, the 10 minutes and go ahead and come up with a ratio of how many times you used present tense versus how many times you were oriented in the, how many times you used versus how many times you were oriented in the present moment. The other thing, and then you might need people who live with you, their help on this, is how to look physiologically. Some people, their face will go very red. Some people, they'll start itching a lot. Some people, if they have trichotillomania, they'll start pulling their hairs, pulling their eyelashes. Some people, they talk really fast, so their heartbeat beats really fast. So what is physiologically visible about you when you're anxious, right? The other thing is think cognitively, right? Like, so what are your thoughts like when you're anxious? What is it? Are you like an alarmist? The world is going to end. Everything is bad. We're not going to find any solution to this problem. The education is really bad. The kids are not retaining anything. So looking at these thoughts, which, they don't necessarily have to be directly related to COVID, but just in general, that will become the way you talk about many things, and make notice of that. And I'm certainly not, but pay attention to spiritually, like, subhanAllah, this year, some people, they became more spiritually disengaged. Their spiritual heart became saturated with many doubts, with many aqeed contemplate, or all of a sudden now they have all of these doubts. And there's other people who, subhanAllah, this time, made them so much more spiritually, their heart more spiritually awake. It was something, that allowed them. Okay, so many of us are like, alhamdulillah, God calls and everything, but we don't have time to examine the spirituality. We don't have time to stop in our very busy life, and say, let me muhasaba and muraqaba on my heart and see what's the spiritual status of my heart. It's very hard. I'm talking for myself too. So when COVID came and the entire world, I don't care if you're in China, if you're in the Middle East, if you're in India, if you're in the States, if you're underdeveloped country, if you're a bully, if you're in war, the whole world, you can say COVID anywhere, in every language understood what that word means, right? So it's like the entire world globally stopped and is trying to understand what's going on. So it's a beautiful invitation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I invite you to think about, why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say, stop the world, for us to think, for us to examine? What are we trying to shift our attention to? Because also is something that makes you shift your attention from something to whatever you're anxious about. So is this something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is utilizing one of his creations, this emotion and anxiety, so we can shift our attention from whatever our routine life was? We had these actions that we did them in orders. We said certain scripts. We call that prayer, right? And we did that 5 times. Or sometimes, you combine them if you are just working and the day shorter and you just have a million excuses. So what is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted us to shift our attention from to? Is something that I think is really important for us to think about. So, oops, sorry about that. So the other thing is, I want to kind of, I read this and I really liked it. Worry is a down payment on a problem you may never have, right? So people who worry all the time, and they worry and they, and mashallah, and like if you want to get an anxious person, they're just over planners. And clinically what we say is that they are very efficient planners, but they are not effective planners. And there's a subtle difference in there that can cause havoc in terms of school and spiritually. And that is, if people who overplan, they come up with plan A, plan B, and C, all the way to Z, including A prime, B prime, and all kind of plans just in case it doesn't work. And they do this even if the problem has 0.5% chance of happening. Okay? And if you try to tell them that, the chance is very low, they'll tell you, but the chance exists, and I'll be prepared if it happens. But you just exhausted your present moment, exhausted your relationships with everybody, including your Lord, as a result of supporting that kind of thinking. And then there's the other side of people who are very effective in their thinking. If they weigh out kind of like, this problem happening is very low, and so I'm not going to burn my present moment planning for that because the percentage is really low. But the other side of this also is really important, that should this happen, 5% actually pan out and happen, I'm confident enough in myself that I'll be able to deal with it. The second part is definitely not there for someone who suffers from an anxiety. The thing is, though, your brain is very limited in capacity, your attention spans particularly, you're using your attention span to support this puzzling, never worry diarrhea, if you will, right? In terms of your thoughts, you don't have very much attention capacity left to pray well, to work well, to parent well. So obviously by now you got the answer. Anxiety is a good emotion. It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has equipped. Sometimes that where an anxiety can go bad. In fact, it can go very bad, right? Where a person is constantly going through worry diarrhea. It's occupying entire, hardware and software in their brain, where there's not much cognitive capacity or modules available to process what's happening, right? Which can affect it can affect their work efficiency. It can affect many things. They become very intolerant. People who are anxious are extremely intolerant of uncertainty. They have very low tolerance of uncertainty. So, so in 2020, where there's tons of uncertainty, they really don't do very well. And because, we've gotten kind of spoiled before 2020, where we can predict with accuracy. I can predict, look at the line and look at the slope and say, well, in 2021, the house market is going to be this much. The stock market will do this, and predict all kind of things. And we are, there's degrees on prediction, right? There's lots of, hardware, software, education, lots on the value of prediction. I've never been taught that uncertainty can be healthy. We've never been taught what to do in cases of uncertainty. However, though, if you open the Quran, though, there's tons of lessons on how to manage uncertainty, right? Tons of explaining that there's only one certain fact, only very limited certainty in this life. So they become very, very, very uncomfortable with this notion of intolerance of uncertainty. And of course, all of this also affects your relationship with your Lord as well. They can become very irritable, right? Because if you're anxious, you're in the future moment, and someone is slowing by talking about what's happening in the present moment, you're like looking at them like, man, we already talked about that, and I'm already planning for next week, and you're slowing me down, and you're very inefficient. And they get irritated by you, by the person who is trying to be grounded in the present moment. And of course, all of this can reduce performance, again, across many domains. And because this is, it doesn't feel good. And by doesn't feel good, I mean on all levels, psychologically, cognitively, biologically, the hormones that are being released, the stress hormones, give you butterflies in your stomach. They make your heart beat fast. They make your blood more viscous. So there's less, movement or fluidity in your blood, which can increase your chances of strokes, heart attack, many things. And of course, all of this can make you ill and can lead to physical symptoms. So there's different flavors or different brands of psychological and anxiety or pathological and anxiety. So there's the generalized anxiety disorder, which is more common than we would like to think. So at least for the youth, 1 every 3 suffers from an anxiety disorder. That's just too many. That's just really too many. We should not be okay with that. As a society, we should not be okay with that. Panic disorder kind of feels like you get a panic attack. You feel like you're getting a heart attack. You feel like you're going to die. It's a really ugly feeling. And sometimes what happens on first panic attack, your second one becomes more likely. You're more likely, and so forth. So the person then becomes like, well, what if I have a panic attack in public and I'm sweating and I can't breathe? And I look really, it's in trouble, and I don't want to look like that in public. I don't want to look like that in a meeting. I don't want to look like that at the masjid. I don't want to look like that in school. In their house, there are actually panic attacks with phobia where they have not left their house for 20 years out of fear that they will experience. And then phobias, and I think that term is probably many people know because it's just always in movies. So a phobia. Actually, I focus on one more common one, the social and anxiety disorder, which used to be under phobias, but not really now. Social and anxiety disorder, where the person has such extreme fear of being judged, of being embarrassed, of being shamed in public, avoid these areas, right? So, a student will only take online classes because they're so worried that the professor is going to make them do or be in a group, ask them a question, or or that they smell, on all of these things, and can be very debilitating, right? And then there's all other kind of an anxiety disorders, such as ones related to medical conditions, but these are kind of like the main ones. So what happened in an anxiety is that you get this kind of imbalance, right? Between you have high up all your, you think of like the cognitive abilities, your decision making, impulse control, being efficient instead of over planning. You have all of these kind of faculties that make human being much more. They make human beings basically, amenable to hisab, right, on Judgment's Day. But they become accountable for their behavior this huge frontal lobe that can do all of these things. Down, buried inside the brain are all of these emotional areas. Okay, I'm familiar with that because it's been in vogue. And what's nice is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created connections between this high up control, cognitive thinking, logical decision making, and down emotional parts. And with an anxiety, the connections between these two parts become less numerous, thinner, they become weaker. What ends up happening is that the elephant in this picture, think of this as your aqli, your cognitive abilities, your decision making, is unable or balancing with this little mouse, right? So then over and over again that there's this imbalance between emotional areas and higher up cognitive areas when the person is anxious. All right, so what do we do, right? Like, obviously, I'm not going to leave you just with no solutions. One is that you can be taught to think differently about events, perception. And I'll talk about this in the next slide in terms of what Islam and Islamic teachings and learning can do to change your perception in a way that can calm the emotional parts of your brain and encourage higher up cognitive areas, more connections, more inhibition, more control, more break on the emotional parts. The other, what's within your control. And alhamdulillah, we have the ni'mah, the blessing of Islam, that everything outside your in control, you actually can resource that. You can everything we're in control of and not in control of subhanahu wa ta'ala. But then to take the burden off yourself and say, it's okay, right? It's something we need to remind ourselves. Right? And of course, if all of this is not working, maybe your genetics are really working against you, you had a troubling childhood, counseling. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not created an illness without a cure, except aging, right? That's what the hadith said. This some of Allah's attributes that indicate Allah's level of control, Allah's oneness, Allah's ability, Allah's certainty. And, as Muslim, we are encouraged to invoke Allah in the attributes that match our request, be of enormous help. And then, what have you done that works? Maybe there are some things that you've done to calm down your anxiety. And remember that anxiety also can give rise to other diseases. On that note, diseases, depression and anxiety have very high comorbidity, means there's a lot of people, a big percentage of people have both anxiety and depression. Okay, let me just say this, and inshallah, I'm going to link the two thoughts. One ayah in the Quran that just makes me think a lot is this, which this phrase is repeated so many times in the Quran in almost that same exact order. لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون, right? They shall feel no fear, nor sadness or loss or grief. What got kind of my attention is that these words were repeated in this exact format 14 times. 6 out of the 14 times were in the second surah, Surah Al-Baqarah. And that fear always comes before sadness. And I didn't understand why, right? And then subhanAllah, I was preparing a series of lectures on depression. And then I was, looking at statistics and, was talking about how anxiety and depression happen together. But the most likely scenario is that you have khawf, you have the anxiety leading to depression. In other words, the anxiety leading to depression. And subhanAllah, when I read that, when I came across these statistics, that ayah just was it's like I can see that ayah in front of me because of how well the statistics matched with that. Now, Islamic framework, and I think my time is up. I'll end with this slide, inshallah, and take up questions. It's really important to all of this. So religious beliefs can provide amazing schemas for how we interpret the world. You can get your schemas, which is, think of schema as a way that you organize hundreds of thoughts into one, so you can generalize instead of thinking of the 100 of thoughts. So a schema can help you organize this. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us schemas, scripts through which we can interpret the world so that it would make it easier for us. And people who have understanding of deen, which is not the same thing as religious, by the way, in terms of showing ibadah and actions, but they really they're very well grounded in their aqidah, in their tawheed, in their relationship and spirituality with Allah. They really do process hardships much better. Why? Because they have a framework, they have schemas, they have things they can verbalize to process the hardship much better. In fact, and I'll end with this thought, inshallah. I won't have time to go through the rest of this. In fact, one of the things that links or rekindles the connections between the frontal cognitive decision logical part and emotional parts, what gets that going is your ability to verbalize what you're feeling, right? To verbalize on. And isn't it so beautiful that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us scripts? Dies, you say inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. When this happens, you say this. When this happens, you say this. In other words, like kind of scripts function to recruit your prefrontal cortex for you in order to have more inhibition break on your lower emotional that can then cause havoc and lead to things like an anxiety disorder. Jazakumullah khairan for being so patient. I will stop sharing now and I will questions inshallah. Barakallahu feekum for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Marwaz. That was a very informative talk. We do have a couple questions lined up, so I'll start with the first one. In the West, we have as Muslims indirectly and sometimes directly internalized the Western notion of uncertainty, which is the opposite of the Islamic notion of it. Which interventions can we use to make a patient that won't accept the uncertainties of life accept the Islamic notion of uncertainty?
MashaAllah. I guess it's Brother Abdullah. He's just saying the question. That was an excellent question. It's really, really excellent question. And it's something certainly I have been kind of like battling with in terms of understanding. Like lately, the term psychology has been kind of in vogue. And I don't think we'd be using Western psychology as an adjunct to treatment or treating a Muslim person. That direction doesn't work. It's more you start with a foundation, Islamic foundation that's very strong. And then whatever fits from West or other teachings, then you take that to fortify a very solid foundation. The inquirer, the person who asked the question, excellent question, is actually our ideas of the West that led to our understanding of uncertainty is what's making us really suffer in 2020. However, we did kind of look at the concept of uncertainty in terms that there's few certain things in life, the oneness of Allah, that there's the hereafter, there's judgment. If we look at, actually there's things you can count in, and it's a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He has with certainty in at times. That's a very different perspective, right, than this. But I'm currently co-authoring a chapter on an example that's meant for psychologists who are not Muslim, who are going to be treating Muslim patients, to use the wealth of information we have in the Quran and Sunnah, such as invoking Allah's attributes, specific attributes that match an anxiety, such as concept of certainty and threat bias and anxiety from an Islamic perspective.
Thank you, Dr. Azab. We have another one here. How can Muslims practice mindfulness to lessen stress and anxiety?
Beautiful. So one, let's start with saying that there's tons of research saying that mindfulness works, right, for an anxiety. Here's the thing, though, is that what is mindfulness? Mindfulness is that in the present moment, that any kind of thought that you have welcomed, including some feelings, you treat as a passing cloud, and you don't kind of marinate your mind in that. We do this 5 times a day, right? In our salah, right? We call it khushu'ah. That's in fact, for who do meditation and all of that, it takes them sometimes years, and they have to travel at a certain level where they can now be mindful. I can now be state. Well, why do we have to these kind of concepts when we have beautiful concepts such as right to anxiety? And these are things that you practice. You don't just go from a person who barely remembers if then third rak'ah in Isha to a person in complete khushu'ah every salah. It takes practice. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and is patient with our inefficiencies, right? Because He creates. So I think mindfulness is great, but I highly recommend also that you utilize some of the tools that Allah, the being that created you and knows your shortcomings, has provided you the toolbox. Use them is, I guess, what I'm saying.
Thank you. Our next question here. How would you approach conservative parents to see if you could reach out for help like therapy? The topic of mental health is very controversial, so how do you approach it in a way that they'd understand?
Okay. So let me, first of all, I do have to admit something. Okay. Many parents, subhanAllah, it's not that they're against therapy, is that they are so worried that if they take their teen, that the non-Muslim therapists will pollute their idea about Islam, which is, by the way, there's a germ of truth in there. So, but it would be very for me to believe that you go to your parent and you say, I'm in pain. I can't sleep at nighttime. The other night, I thought I was going to die because I thought I was having a heart attack. And this didn't happen once, it happened to me multiple times. It means that if I'm driving the car, I could die because I'm not cognitively aware when I'm having a panic attack. I need help. And then can you help me? And, start with a Muslim therapist. And the person could be the has like 5 degrees on their wall, but if you don't connect with them, they're not going to do anything for you. So I highly recommend you interview 4 or 5 people on the phone who you as a patient connect with, not connects to, whoever the teen connects to, right? You can start with that. Let's say you didn't find the Muslim therapist where you are, although now everything is virtual, it'll be way easier than before. But let's say, then I would, the second tier, look at a therapist who is religiously and culturally sensitive, who had some sort of training in cultural just kind of things that will take this into the packaging of how the parents. So these are kind of the I would go with. But I would say invoke parent sympathy. Sometimes as a teen, you just that your parent won't understand, but it's difficult for a parent to see their child in pain. So you got to really verbalize to get that sympathy. You are in pain. What does your pain? What's your pain preventing you from doing? Is really right. In order for you to get that sympathy, and inshallah, the parent. In the very rare circumstances, say the parent is really against it, I would kind of recruit an old uncle, ammo, and tant, from the community that your parent is comfortable with, and maybe have that person mediate that kind of conversation.
Thank you. Our next question, do you think apps that help in calmness are helpful in controlling anxiety? Are there any Islamic apps for calmness?
So I didn't hear do you think what? What's the app or?
Do you think phone apps that help in calmness are helpful in controlling anxiety? And do you know any Islamic ones?
Honestly, I don't know. Like, I don't know if they work. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that one.
Okay. Our next one here, can untreated anxiety create other problems, either mentally or physically?
I can definitely, it will. Not it might, it will. And that is an exact one in line in terms of psychological order is depression. Extremely highly common that an anxiety becomes so unmanageable and it becomes a habitual thinking. That's why treatment is so important. Because the longer your brain circuits function, think way, it becomes more than of a habit of thinking. And then it can take you a long fix. And then that's why you must seek treatment. Psychologically, but in terms of physically, of course, right? Like stress hormones, as I said earlier, in the blood, which means less blood to the heart attack, to the brain. There's tons of stress related. Gives off years off your life. Subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed how long you're going to live, but that affects your mortality. It increases the divorce rate. It affects many things.
Thank you. Our next question is a little similar to one we already had, but is there any way to get rid of anxiety when it gets really hard on us?
Yes. So you really don't wait till you're having the attack the panic attack or the anxiety attack when it's so controllable. Like, okay, so for example, I am really scared of cockroaches. Maybe I shouldn't say that out there, because if somebody tortured me, they might like bring cockroaches around me and it will really work. I'll whatever you want. So it doesn't matter what you say to me cognitively. It doesn't matter if you say, but it's so scared of you, it will run away, you can squish, you can say whatever you want. I'm still scared of the cockroach. It's the same thing when the person is going through a panic attack, through an anxiety attack. Frontal cortex, their thinking part is closed for business. Nothing you can say cognitively will get rid of this. And that's why you want to save the person, you want to treat the person. Nonetheless, let's say you are having the attack. There's breathing exercises that you learn to try to help the anxiety, to make you rout the attack, or maybe reduce, the length of it, right? It'll still feel really bad. But the best thing is to, before it happens, you seek out some help. And if it's somewhat manageable, there's tons of self-help books that have exercises that you can do. Some of them are very good. There's ones dedicated to teens that are very good. There are exercises that are available on YouTube that will take you 1 minute to do. They work the breathing exercises work really well because you trick your system into having stressful part of your nervous system on. And if you do it regularly, not just when you're anxious, it works exceptionally well.
Thank you. Our next one here, what do you think of the use of medication for anxiety and drugs such as Adderall to treat anxiety?
Adderall for anxiety, or maybe they mean ADHD? That's an interesting, that'd be very interesting why they would use, that's interesting to say the least. Adderall is usually for ADHD, for attention and focus. But, of course, you have, thank you for asking that. Sometimes the child or the teen, he has an anxiety, but in terms of their performance, because remember, you're having worry diarrhea, thoughts are nonstop, you can't think. So it actually appears to the educator as though they have ADHD. So when you actually treat the anxiety, you lift the veil that was covered, and then it's actually not ADHD, it's actually an anxiety. A very common one. And of course, this between the two. I'm not sure about the Adderall question, but let's just say in general, medication for this. I'm not a doctor. I don't prescribe medication. So I encourage nobody, whether it's me saying it or anyone out there, to get off any medication with their doctor. You can literally commit suicide if you stop, let's say, an antidepressant, consulting. You can't do that. These medications are serious. These medications do have long-term effect on the brain. They do restructure the brain. The medications, when they're giving at a tentative, tender stage, such as teenage years, you should not really give antidepressants at that time because suicidal ideations. It really have a big effect because the brain is going through a form of reorganization, but I think last year at Mass, that it can have really an impact that stay for many years. Doctor will probably not talk to you about the long-term effects of these medications. These medications, you do have withdrawal, you do have dependence on them. Having said all of this, okay, there are people who need medications, and the medication can manage. The medication can save, their abilities at work. So I'm not saying no medication. I'm saying better diagnosis for the disorder, because we're not even good at that yet. And better diagnosis for the disorder, getting 1-3 opinion. I know of a particular case of this gentleman who was giving bipolar medication for years since he was a child. Like, but I consider under 18 a child. But lithium for bipolar is a very serious medication. And then the doctors were like, actually, he doesn't have bipolar, ADHD. Actually, he doesn't have ADHD after being ill. He actually has an anxiety, and let's put him in bed SSRIs. So this is, take your time, that's your brain. But when you have the disorder diagnosed well and you need the medication, by all means.
Thank you. This will probably be our last question. how should parents help with a child who has anxiety or is experiencing anxiety?
I think the number one thing to do is to sympathize. Again, when people anxiety, you look from the outside and you're like, there's nothing wrong with you. They're typically good students. They are the people who worry about their test. When is their test? Are they going to do well on their test? Like getting that, and also, giving them accommodations at school important. Like many parents are really this one. It's like, I'm not going to have my child, get separate accommodation, or the child himself or herself maybe stuck. Well, I don't want to get special accommodation, but having just small changes at school, like having the child or the teen the test in a room where there's less noise, where there's less where there's less people, that makes them anxious. That can increase the performance and therefore their chances in life tremendously. That's one thing to do practically at school. The other thing is I understand, I listened to a talk about this. I looked at some information about this. I wrote an article about exactly what in the anxious mind, called Inside the Anxious Mind. Right. And I've been told when family members read it, they're like, okay, they start to sympathize. So do your homework on this. Wow, you've been feeling this for years. I'm so sorry that I wasn't able to really support you in more ways. This must feel terrible. This must be so painful for you. Right. And and I'm here to support you in whatever capacity. Right. And then starting that healing journey with them. But again, accompanied with actions and resources available, such as at school, at work, depending on how old that person is.
Thank you, Dr. Marwaz. I think that's all the time we have. We do have a few more questions, but I believe there's a mental health panel that will be happening tomorrow. So make sure you log into that session and you can ask the rest of your questions there. A lot of our viewers are saying thank you.
Yes. Very welcome.
So, all right.
Assalamu alaikum.